Security. Get this man out of my meeting before I call the police. Vivian Ashcroft said it loud in a marble hotel lobby about the man in the plain gray shirt who had just offered her his hand. She looked him up and down at the clothes that weren't expensive enough for a room like this and decided in half a second that he didn't belong in it. Isaac Bellamy lowered his hand. He didn't argue. He walked out with his head high past the phones already recording. Here's what Vivian didn't know. The man she'd just had thrown into the street ran a fund worth billions, had studied her dying company for 8 months, and was the only investor left on Earth willing to save it. Her company had 11 weeks of cash left, and she had just spent 3 minutes destroying the one person who could have given her more. If you've ever been sized up and dismissed by someone who never bothered to learn who you were, stay with this one. Subscribe and follow along, because the man Vivian Ashcroft threw out of that lobby was about to teach her the most expensive lesson of her life, and he wasn't going to raise his voice once to do it. The Four Seasons lobby caught the morning light and threw it back in soft gold across the marble, and Vivian Ashcroft stood in the middle of it, exactly where she liked to stand, at the center of the room. She wore a cream suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her heels clicked with authority when she moved, and she was laughing at something one of the 2 visiting investors had said, a bright, practiced laugh she had used in 1,000 rooms like this one. She had built her whole life on rooms like this, on the certainty that she belonged at the center of them, and it had never once occurred to her that the certainty was a kind of blindness. She was 41 years old, and she had been told she was exceptional for so long that she had stopped hearing it as a compliment and started hearing it as a fact about the shape of the world. Stanford had told her. The magazines that put her on their lists had told her. Her father, who had built a fortune in real estate and raised her in a house with a name, had told her most of all, in 1,000 small ways, that people divided into those who mattered and those who served, and that a woman like her would always be counted among the former. She had never questioned it because it had never cost her anything to believe it. What the 2 investors did not know, and what Vivian was working hard to keep them from sensing, was that her company was dying. Ashcroft Systems had been worth $800 million not 2 years earlier, and now the number on the balance sheet made her hands go cold when she let herself look at it. The company burned through $8 million every month, and the account held enough to last 11 more weeks, and after that, there was a word she could not make herself say, even in the privacy of her own mind. She had pitched 23 investors in 8 months, and 23 had said no, and now there was exactly 1 name left on the list, and it belonged to a man she had never bothered to look up. Across the lobby, the glass doors sighed open, and a man came in out of the bright cold morning carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. He was in his late 30s, unhurried, with a calm that filled the space around him rather than demanding it, and he was dressed in a plain gray shirt and dark trousers and clean, simple shoes. His name was Isaac Bellamy, and almost nothing about the way he looked that morning would have told a stranger the truth of him. He had grown up in a part of the city that people like Vivian saw only through a car window, on the way to somewhere better, raised by a mother who worked 3 jobs, and he had earned his way to a scholarship, and then built something the largest banks in the country had lined up to buy. Now he ran a fund that managed billions, and he sat on boards whose names people said with reverence. Isaac had learned something about the rooms he moved through, and it had become a kind of quiet instrument he carried everywhere. When he wore the expensive suit, people were warm to him and told him what they thought he wanted to hear, and he learned nothing true about who they were. When he walked in dressed plainly as himself, the ones who mattered still saw the man, and the ones who did not showed him in the first 3 seconds exactly how they treated anyone they had decided was beneath them. He had said it in more than one interview in words he thought were plain enough for anyone. He dressed simply on purpose. He wanted to know who respected the idea and who only respected the wallet. Vivian had read none of that because she never read the briefs her assistant prepared. That was what assistants were for. She had glanced at the line on her calendar that said 9 o'clock investor and had assumed the investor would be grateful for the audience. So when Isaac crossed the marble and stopped in front of her and put out his hand, she was not ready for him, because she had never imagined she would need to be. "Vivian Ashcroft," Isaac said. "Isaac Bellamy, we have a 9 o'clock about the investment. Thank you for making the time." Vivian looked at his hand. She did not take it. She looked at the plain gray shirt and the simple shoes, and something in her face closed like a door, and she took a small step back the way a person steps back from something unclean. "I'm sorry," she said. "Who let you in here exactly?" The two investors beside her stopped talking. Isaac kept his hand out a moment longer, still warm. "There may be some confusion," he said. "My office confirmed this meeting 3 weeks ago. You're welcome to call your assistant." "This is a private meeting," Vivian said, and her voice began to climb so that it carried across the marble. "For serious investors, not for people who wander in off the street thinking they can talk their way into a room like this." She looked him up and down, slow and deliberate, making certain the two men saw her do it. "People like you." The words hung there. The older of the two investors, a silver-haired German named Klaus Reinhardt, shifted and murmured that perhaps they should let the gentleman speak, and Vivian held up a single manicured finger without looking at him. "I don't know what you're trying to pull," she said, "showing up dressed like you're going to a barbecue. But I don't do business with people who lie their way into my meetings." Isaac lowered his hand. He did not raise his voice, and the steadiness of him, if she had been paying any attention, might have warned her. "I'm a managing partner at Bellamy Capital," he said. "My firm manages billions of dollars. We've been in contact with your own chief financial officer for months." Vivian laughed an ugly, disbelieving sound. "Of course you are," she said. "And next you'll tell me you sit on the board at Apple." She turned toward the security desk and lifted her hand as though she had spotted a thief. "Excuse me, can someone help me over here?" 2 guards came across the lobby, and one of them was an older man named Jerome, whose face showed plainly how little he wanted any part of this. "This man is disrupting a private meeting," Vivian told them, pointing at Isaac the way a person points at litter. "He's not on any list. I want him removed from the building." "There's no need for an escort," Isaac said to Jerome evenly. "I can find my own way out." "Oh, he'll be escorted," Vivian said. "Walk him all the way to the street. I don't want him slipping into some other meeting." The walk across that lobby was long, and every eye in it followed him, and at least one phone was up and recording the whole of it. Isaac kept his head level and his steps unhurried. At the door, Jerome leaned in close. "I'm sorry about this, sir," Jerome said low. "I'm just doing my job." "I know," Isaac told him. "It's not you." Then he was out on the bright, cold sidewalk, and he stood there a moment, letting his heartbeat settle, feeling the old, familiar weight in his chest that he had felt in classrooms and restaurants and conference halls his whole life, the weight of being decided about before he had said a single word. His phone buzzed. It was his chief advisor, Amara, and he answered it, looking back once through the glass at the woman in the cream suit, already laughing again, with her guests already smoothing her sleeve as though she had brushed away something distasteful. "How did it go?" Amara asked. "Cancel the rest of my day," Isaac said. "Book me on the next flight home." "What about the 500 million, the 8 months of work?" "I just got my answer," Isaac told her. "It took about 3 minutes." Inside, Vivian turned back to the two investors with a brilliant, recovering smile. "I am so sorry about that," she said. "You would not believe how many opportunists try to crash meetings like this." Klaus Reinhardt did not smile back. "Vivian," he said, "that seemed rather harsh." "You have to be firm with people like that," she said, waving it away. "Otherwise, they think they can waste your time." The two men exchanged a glance she did not catch. "We have a flight," Klaus said. "And in any case, we told you no last week. We only came by to be polite." They shook her hand quickly and left her standing alone in the middle of the golden lobby she had been so sure belonged to her. She frowned for just a moment, watching them go. Then she shrugged it off and took out her phone and texted her assistant to delete that man's information from the company's files because she did not want his type thinking they could waste her time again. She had no idea that his type was the only thing standing between her company and the end of everything she had built, and she had no idea that in less than 3 hours she was going to learn exactly who Isaac Bellamy was, and that the learning was going to take from her everything she had spent her whole life believing she deserved. By 10:30, Vivian was back in her office on the 42nd floor, and she had already forgotten the man in the gray shirt. She had a call with the board in 20 minutes and a company hemorrhaging money beneath her, and the small unpleasantness in the lobby had filed itself away in the same drawer where she kept every other moment that had briefly inconvenienced her. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the bay stretched out blue and indifferent, and Vivian looked at it the way she always did, as a thing that belonged to the view from her office which belonged to her. Her assistant knocked and came in without quite waiting to be told, and that alone was unusual enough to make Vivian look up. Dana Cortez did not startle easily, but this morning her face had gone the color of paper, and she held her tablet, the way a person holds something they do not want to be holding. "I need to ask you about the man from the hotel this morning," Dana said. "The one security walked out." "Make it quick," Vivian said, already turning back to her screen. "I've got the board in 20 minutes. "Did you look him up before the meeting?" Something in the careful way she asked it made the cold begin to gather low in Vivian's stomach before she understood why. "Of course I didn't," Vivian said. "I don't Google every person who tries to crash my meetings." Dana set the tablet down on the desk, turned so Vivian could see the screen, and stepped back. "That's Isaac Bellamy," she said quietly. "From Bellamy Capital." It was a magazine profile, the kind that ran with a full photograph, and the photograph was the man from the lobby, the same calm face, the plain shirt she had sneered at, worn on purpose, in a portrait that had been seen by more people than Vivian would meet in her lifetime. Her eyes went to the figures beside it, and the words swam, and then snapped into a terrible sharpness. A fund worth billions. A ranking she recognized because she had spent her whole life wanting to be on the list it belonged to. Board seats at companies whose names she said with reverence. "Tell me this is a different Isaac Bellamy," Vivian said. Her voice had gone hoarse. "Some other man with the same name." "It's not," Dana said, and she reached over and scrolled gently, and there were more photographs. Isaac beside people whose faces everyone knew. Isaac on a stage at a conference in the mountains where the powerful of the world gathered every winter. In every single one he was dressed plainly the way he had been that morning. "The meeting was confirmed 3 weeks ago," Dana said. "I have the emails. He flew across the country to discuss the investment, $500 million. The number landed in Vivian's chest like a struck bell because $500 million was the difference between 11 weeks and a future between bankruptcy and the life she had built, and she had thrown it out of a hotel lobby with her own 2 hands, while a stranger recorded her doing it. She stood so fast her chair rolled back and struck the window, and she did not notice. She found his number in the folder of contacts she had ordered deleted that very morning, and her fingers were sweating so badly she had to wipe them on her skirt before the call would connect. It rang once and again, and a third time, and then his voicemail told her in that same calm voice to leave a message. "Mr. Bellamy, this is Vivian Ashcroft," she said. "I believe there was a terrible misunderstanding this morning. I would be honored to reschedule at your earliest convenience. Please call me back." She hung up and called again and got the voicemail again, and this time she could not make herself speak. She called her chief financial officer into the office, and Harold Finch came in 3 minutes later holding a coffee and a folder of quarterly reports. She turned the tablet toward him without a word. She watched his face travel from confusion to recognition to a horror that made her own stomach drop further, and she watched the coffee tilt in his hand and spill unnoticed onto the reports. Please tell me you didn't have Isaac Bellamy removed from a building this morning, Harold said. I didn't know who he was, Vivian said. He showed up dressed like a student. He's famous for that. Harold set the ruined reports down on her desk. He wrote about it in the Wall Street Journal. He never wears a suit. It's the whole point. Everyone in this industry knows it. Can we fix it? Bellamy Capital was our last option, Vivian. 23 firms have already said no. He was interested at all because he spent 8 months studying our technology and came to believe in it. Harold looked up from his phone. And here's the part you need to understand. He doesn't invest in pitch decks. He invests in people, in how someone treats the ones they think can do nothing for them. He's said it in every interview he's ever given. Vivian tried the number twice more while Harold stood there and got the voicemail both times and did not leave a message. She wrote an email instead, her fingers unsteady, an apology dressed up as a scheduling mix-up, a hectic morning, warmest regards, and she hit send, and the small sound it made felt unbearably final. Harold was still scrolling and his face changed, and he turned the phone toward her. Reinhardt posted something, he said. It named no one, but it did not need to. It described witnessing a shocking display of unprofessionalism at a meeting that morning, and it said that how a person treated others said everything about their character, and it had already been shared hundreds of times, while Vivian watched the number climb. Her phone rang in her hand and she flinched and nearly dropped it, but it was not Isaac. It was Charles Delaney, the chairman of her board, and his voice when she answered was colder than she had ever heard it. I just came off a call with one of the men who was in that lobby, Charles said. Tell me it isn't true. Tell me you didn't refuse to shake a man's hand and call security on him. Tell me that man wasn't Isaac Bellamy. Charles, I can explain. Do you understand what you've done? Charles said. We need $500 million to survive. Bellamy was the last door open to us. And you slammed it in public on the one man in this industry who never gives a second chance to people who show him who they are. The line went dead. Vivian tried Isaac again and got the voicemail again, and this time did not try to speak. She wrote a second email and a third, each one shedding a little more of the pretense than the last, each one admitting a little more of the truth. Noon came and there was no answer. 1 o'clock and no answer. By 2, her phone had begun to ring with other numbers, board members and investors and her own public relations firm, and she stopped answering any of them, and she sat in her corner office with the beautiful, indifferent bay behind her and felt the floor of her life beginning to give way. At some point in that long afternoon, unable to stop herself, she began to read about him. Not the balance sheets now, but the man, his interviews, his words. And this was the part that would stay with her longest, longer than the lost money, longer than the calls she could not make herself answer. Because as she read, she understood that Isaac Bellamy had told her exactly what was going to happen years before it happened, in words plain enough for anyone to understand. He had said in a profile 2 years old that he dressed simply on purpose to see whether people respected the idea or the wallet that it was a filter, and that the ones who saw past the plain shirt were the only ones worth working with. He had said in another that the worst kind of prejudice was not the loud, obvious kind, but the thousands of small, quiet moments in which someone decided you did not belong before you had opened your mouth. She read that line 3 times. She had been one of those moments. She had walked into it with her eyes wide open and her certainty intact, and she had failed a test she had not even known she was taking in front of witnesses with a phone recording every second. There was a more recent interview, and in it he said, without heat, without self-pity, only as a plain fact of his life, that he had been mistaken for the help more times than he could count for kitchen staff and drivers and security, and that each time he learned something true about the person doing the mistaking. Vivian sat with that one for a long time. She knew now exactly what he had learned about her. She closed the laptop and put her head in her hands in the office she had made her whole identity, on the 42nd floor she had been so proud of, and she understood the shape of what had happened, and it was worse than a mistake. A mistake could be explained. A mistake could be a hectic morning, and a crossed schedule smoothed over with an apology and a rescheduled meeting. But this had not been a mistake. She had looked at a man dressed plainly and dismissed him without a second's thought, and the dismissing had come from somewhere so deep and so automatic that she had not even felt herself do it. Isaac Bellamy had not misjudged her at all. He had seen her with perfect clarity, and now she was beginning to understand so would everyone else. Outside her windows, the afternoon light lengthened and turned gold across the bay, beautiful in a way that felt almost insulting, and Vivian Ashcroft sat alone in the ruins of a single ordinary morning and waited for a phone call that was not going to come from a man who had already given her his answer and had needed only 3 minutes and a plain gray shirt to give it. By evening, the story had a shape of its own and had stopped needing Vivian to feed it. A technology blog ran a piece sourced to someone familiar with the matter, and it had the details, the lobby, the guards, the refused hand. And though it named no witness, it did not need to. By the time the sun went down, the incident was no longer something that had happened to Vivian in private. It was something the industry was watching, and the industry she was learning had opinions. The consequences did not arrive as a single blow. They arrived the way water finds the cracks in a foundation everywhere at once, and from directions she had not thought to defend. 2 other boards on which she sat sent careful, regretful notes suggesting that perhaps this was a season for her to step back. A conference in the spring quietly removed her name from its list of speakers. None of it was cruel. All of it was final. And none of it, she understood, was being done to her by Isaac Bellamy, who had said not one public word, who had simply walked out of a lobby and let her own conduct do the rest. That was the thing she could not get past in the long, sleepless night that followed. There was no one to fight. If Isaac had struck back, if he had gone to the press, if he had said a single vengeful word, she could have made him the villain and herself the victim of an overreaction, because that was a story she knew how to tell. But he had done nothing. He had absorbed the insult without a flicker and walked away, and every consequence crashing down on her now was the simple gravity of what she herself had done made visible at last. By morning, she had made the only decision left to her that was not surrender, which was to go to him. Not to call, not to email, because she had done both to the point of humiliation, and he had answered neither. She flew across the country on the first flight she could get in yesterday's cream suit because she had not been able to think clearly enough to pack another, and she took a car to the glass tower where Bellamy Capital kept its offices, and she walked into a lobby of white marble that made her own heels echo, and she asked to see him. The young woman at the front desk was polite and immovable. "Mr. Bellamy sees people by appointment," she said. "Do you have one?" "No," Vivian said, "but it's urgent. I only need 5 minutes. I flew across the country." The young woman made a quiet call, listened, and hung up. "I'm sorry," she said. "Mr. Bellamy is in meetings all day." "Then I'll wait," Vivian said, and she waited. She waited while the morning wore on, and employees passed her and glanced and looked away. She waited through people returning from lunch, their laughter dying when they recognized the woman from the story sitting alone in the lobby. She waited past the point of dignity, and then past the point of caring about it 3 hours and more, until the arithmetic of it became a thing she could not stop turning over. She had needed 3 minutes to decide that Isaac Bellamy did not deserve to stand in her lobby. She had now spent more than 3 hours in his, and the distance between those 2 numbers was the whole of what she had failed to understand about the world. It was past 1 in the afternoon when the young woman came to her again. "Mr. Bellamy will give you 15 minutes, she said. "There's a conference room on the 4th floor. Isaac was already there when she came in a simple button-down and jeans, and he did not stand, and he did not offer his hand. He gestured to the chair across the table without warmth or cruelty, only a level attention that was harder to sit under than either would have been. "Mr. Bellamy." Vivian began. "I came here to—" Isaac lifted one hand. "Before you apologize," he said, I want to make one thing clear, because you keep framing this as if the problem is that you didn't know who I was. Vivian's mouth stayed open and nothing came out of it. The problem was never that you didn't know my net worth, Isaac said. The problem is that you looked at a man in a plain shirt and decided before I said a word that he didn't belong in the room. You refused my hand. You called security. You had me removed in front of 50 people. He folded his hands on the table, and his voice did not rise at all, which somehow made each word land harder. If I had been a 60-year-old white man in an expensive suit, would you have done any of that? Would you have looked me up and down and called me a liar? Would you have had me thrown into the street? Vivian, who had spent a lifetime performing certainty, found she could not perform anything at all. No, she said, and it barely crossed the small table. No, I wouldn't have. That's the problem, Isaac said. Not a mistaken identity. Not a hectic morning. The tears came then, and Vivian did not wipe them, because wiping them would have been a performance too, and she had none left. You're right, she said, and I'm ashamed. I didn't come here to explain myself because there's no explanation. I came to ask for something I have no right to ask for. She made herself hold his eyes. My company employs 3,000 people who did nothing wrong. They'll lose their jobs if it goes under. If you say no, I deserve the no. But they don't. Isaac studied her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, though it did not soften into forgiveness. You sat in my lobby for more than 3 hours, he said. Yes. Yesterday morning, you had me removed from yours in 3 minutes. He let that sit. It's interesting how a person's sense of who's worth waiting for changes when they need something. Vivian flinched and said that she knew. I'll invest, Isaac said, and Vivian's breath caught and he lifted his hand again before she could speak. Don't thank me yet, not until you've heard the conditions. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. She read it and her hands began to shake again with each line. A public acknowledgement in her own words of exactly what she had done, named plainly without the softening language of misunderstanding. An independent audit of the culture of her company top to bottom made real and not buried. A board remade so that it no longer looked like a portrait of a single kind of person. A significant donation from her own money and not the company's to organizations that opened doors for the people her industry kept shutting out. Months of sustained work with a coach, the real and uncomfortable kind. Quarterly reports on all of it. And her own transition out of the chief executive's chair to make room for someone the company should have been elevating all along. She looked up from the page. This was the end of the person she had spent 41 years being. Her title, her pride, the identity she had built on the certainty that she belonged at the center of every room. I agree, she said. Don't thank me, Isaac said again. I want you to be very clear about this because it matters. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for the 3,000 people who work for you who had no say in how you treated a stranger in a lobby. He leaned back. And I'm doing it for every person who gets looked at and dismissed before they say a word. The ones who don't run funds worth billions who can't fly across the country and demand a meeting. The ones who just absorb it again and again and are expected to keep absorbing it in silence. Most of them never get an apology. Most of them never get a room like this, or a sheet of paper, or a second chance. You're getting one because 3,000 people are standing behind you and you happen to be the one holding the door. Don't mistake it for grace. Vivian nodded and stood, and her legs did not feel entirely her own. At the door she stopped because she had to ask. Why? She said. If you believe all of this, why trust that I'll actually do the work instead of performing it and walking away? Isaac looked at her. I don't, he said. Not yet. Trust isn't something you get handed across a table in exchange for a signature. It's something you earn slowly in the only currency I've ever respected, which isn't words. It's what a person does when they think the test is finally over. He let a beat pass. And the test is never over, Miss Ashcroft. That's the part people like you always get wrong. The press conference was held 2 days later in the largest room at Ashcroft Systems, and nothing about it had been arranged to flatter her. No makeup artist had smoothed her face that morning. No public relations team had polished the words into something that would land softly. Vivian had written the statement herself at 4 in the morning, and then rewritten it because the first version still had the softening language in it, the phrases that let her hide, and Isaac's sheet of paper had asked for the plain truth. She stood at the podium under the lights with a single page in her hands and no armor of any kind. 3 days ago, she said, and her voice shook and she let it, I committed an act of racial profiling. I refused to shake the hand of a man who traveled across the country to meet with me. I judged him on his clothing and the color of his skin rather than a single fact about who he was. I called security on him. I had him removed from a building in front of 50 people. She made herself keep going. There is no excuse. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a stressful morning. It was prejudice mine, and it did real harm to a person who had done nothing but offer me his hand. The cameras clicked and flared. She read the commitments off the page, the audit, the remade board, the donation from her own money, the bias work, and then she looked up and made herself meet the eyes of the room. I hope my failure can be a lesson to someone, she said, because success in business means nothing at all if you fail at the simplest test of being decent to another human being. The questions came fast then, and they were not gentle, and she did not ask them to be. Will you resign as chief executive? A reporter near the front called out. I'll be stepping out of the role within the month, Vivian said. Do you think an apology is enough? No. Words are never enough. Only what I do afterward will mean anything, and I intend to spend the rest of my working life proving I've learned this. And then a reporter near the back asked the question that mattered more than any of the others. Would you have faced any of these consequences if the man in the lobby hadn't happened to be a billionaire? Vivian stood in the lights and gave the most honest answer she had ever given in public. No, she said. If Isaac Bellamy had been an ordinary man in ordinary clothes, no one would have recorded it. No board would have called. No story would have run. I would have gone back to my office and forgotten his face by lunch the way I've forgotten 100 faces before his. I'm facing consequences only because the man I wronged had power. The people I wronged before him, the ones without it, simply absorbed it in silence. Her voice did not perform anything. That's the real problem. It's bigger than me. And it doesn't get solved by punishing one woman at a podium. The room went quiet in a different way after that because she had said the thing the story itself did not want, said the thing that turned it from a satisfying spectacle of one bad person getting what she deserved into something harder and truer and less comfortable to watch. She walked off the stage on legs that did not feel like hers. By evening, the headlines were everywhere, and none of them were kind, and she did not expect them to be. The board met that night in a session she was not invited to, and at 8 o'clock her phone rang, and it was Charles Delaney. The vote's done, Charles said. You're removed as chief executive effective immediately. You'll keep a non-executive seat on the board for 6 months while we decide what comes next. Who takes the company? Vivian asked. There was a pause. Dr. Elias Nguyen. The name landed on her with a weight she had not expected. Her own chief operating officer of the last 3 years, the quiet, careful, brilliant man she had passed over twice for exactly this role, because he did not command a room the way she did, because he listened more than he spoke. She had mistaken his steadiness for a lack of ambition, the same way she had mistaken a plain gray shirt for a lack of worth. He'll be good, Vivian said quietly, and she meant it. He'd better be, Charles said. You put us all in an impossible place. The line went dead. The consequences kept coming in the days and weeks after, and they were real and heavy and did not stop when the news cycle moved on. The other boards asked her to resign in earnest, and she resigned. The speaking invitations that had once filled her calendar simply stopped arriving. 2 organizations she tried to join afterward declined her without explanation, and none was needed. At a fundraiser she had attended for years, conversation dropped when she entered a room, and people remembered somewhere else they needed to be, and she left early and drove home through streets she had driven 1,000 times and found that everything looked the same, and nothing was. She was not being destroyed exactly. She was being seen at last, and the seeing was a kind of exile she had spent her whole life inflicting on others without ever once feeling it herself. But the company did not die, and that was the thing that mattered, the reason any of it had been done at all. Bellamy Capital's investment closed $500 million, and the number that had once made Vivian's hands go cold stopped being a countdown to the end. 3,000 people kept their jobs. Most of them would never know how close it had come, or that their futures had hung for a few days on whether a woman on the 42nd floor could be made to see what she had done. Isaac released a single short statement through his office when the deal closed, and it did not mention Vivian by name. "Real change requires more than words," it read. "We'll be watching closely to see whether the commitments are honored. This was never about one incident. It's about the 1,000 quiet ones that never make the news." Elias Nguyen took the company, and under him it began slowly to become something Vivian had never had the eyes to build. The independent audit came back, and its findings were difficult patterns she had presided over and never seen capable people who had left because they had understood long before she did that the room was not built for them. Elias did not bury the report. He stood in front of the whole company and read it out, the hard numbers and the harder ones. "This is what we were," he told them, and then he clicked to the next slide. "Now let me show you what we're going to become instead." The changes were not decorations. They were structural, and they were real. And within a year, the company was not only surviving, but stronger than it had been under her, because it turned out that a great many talented people had been waiting a long time for permission to do their best work, and someone had finally given it to them. And the thing rippled outward the way these things do when they are true enough. Other companies in the industry watching began to run their own audits, some because they meant it, and some because their own people demanded it, and the standard for what a leader could get away with shifted a few degrees in a direction it had needed to shift for a long time. A business school wrote the whole affair up as a case study assigned to students who would run companies of their own one day, and the lesson at the center of it was not simply, do not be cruel in a lobby, but something larger. That the way a person treats the ones they believe can do nothing for them is the truest measure of who they are. Through all of it, Isaac Bellamy did not change, and Vivian came over that long year to understand that this was the whole of the point. He did not take a victory lap. He did not give the interviews he could have given. He went on dressing the way he had always dressed, running the same quiet test on everyone he met because the world had not changed, even if one small corner of it had. He expanded the fund he had built for founders who came up the way he had come up from the same overlooked neighborhoods the world drove past on its way to somewhere richer, and he wanted no credit for any of it, because credit had never been the thing he was after. Vivian did the work, and that was the part that surprised the people who had written her off, and it surprised her most of all. She went to the coaching sessions, the real and uncomfortable kind, and sat in rooms where she was not the most important person and did not get to be. "You've been in this industry 20 years, the coach said to her in one session. "How is this the first time you're confronting any of it?" "I thought voting the right way was enough," Vivian said. "Donating to the right causes. I thought that made me one of the good ones." "Those are the easy things," the coach told her without cruelty. "The passive things. What happened in that lobby wasn't a failure of your politics. It was something a lot deeper and closer to the bone. It was slow. It did not make her a hero. She was not redeemed, and she knew better now than to expect to be, because she had learned that redemption was not a moment you arrived at, but a practice you kept or didn't for the rest of your life. She made the donation, and it was real money, and it cost her, and she meant it to cost her. She sent the quarterly reports to Isaac's office, and for a long time he did not respond to them, and she did not expect him to, because she understood at last that she was not owed a response, that she was earning something that could not be demanded. She taught eventually a single seminar at the university, where she had once been the kind of alumna who got invited to give the triumphant commencement address, and the seminar was about bias in leadership, and she taught it not as an expert who had solved the problem, but as a cautionary example who had lived it. She stood in front of young people who would run companies of their own someday, and told them the things she wished someone had made her understand before it cost her everything. Examine yourself, she told them, before your assumptions cost someone else. Your certainty is not the same thing as being right. 1 year after the morning in the lobby, Ashcroft Systems held its annual investor summit, and it was held in the same Four Seasons in the same marble room where a man in a plain gray shirt had once been walked to the street. But everything else was different. The room was fuller, and it held more kinds of faces, and there was an ease in it that had not been there before. Isaac Bellamy walked through the entrance at 9 o'clock in a charcoal polo and pressed slacks, his portfolio under his arm, and this time Vivian was waiting at the door, not to charm an investor, not to work a room, but to meet him. "Mr. Bellamy," she said, and extended her hand. "Thank you for coming." Isaac looked at it for a moment, and then he shook it firm and even. "Thank you for the invitation, Vivian." First names earned across a year of quarterly reports and hard conversations and slow proof not given freely. They walked into the summit together, and later they sat on a panel together, and a moderator asked Isaac how it was possible that he was sharing a stage with the woman who had once had him thrown out of that very building. "Because Vivian did something rare," Isaac said. "She took real accountability. Not a press release, the slow, painful, sustained kind that most people in power never even attempt." He looked at her. "That doesn't erase what happened, but it builds something new." The moderator turned to Vivian and asked what she would say to the woman she had been a year earlier. Vivian was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, but it carried everything. "I would tell her that her certainty was blinding her," she said. "That she was about to harm someone because she couldn't see past her own assumptions, and that it would take losing everything to finally open her eyes." She turned to Isaac. "And I would tell her that no one should have to be a billionaire to be treated like a human being. That was never the lesson. That was just the only reason the world made me learn it." Here's the thing about this story, the part worth carrying out of it after the satisfying part fades. It's easy to watch a woman like Vivian Ashcroft lose everything and feel that justice has been done. It's satisfying to see the powerful face a consequence, to watch someone who looked down on a stranger get looked down on in turn. But if that's all you take from this, you've taken the shallow version, because Isaac Bellamy never wanted a spectacle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ruin her. He simply walked out of a lobby and let the truth of what she'd done arrive on its own. And the truth was never really about one bad morning. It was about the 1,000 small moments that never get recorded, the ones where someone decides you don't belong before you've said a single word, based on your clothes, your accent, the neighborhood you came from, the color of your skin. Vivian faced a reckoning only because the man she wronged happened to have power. The people she'd wronged before him, the ones without a fund worth billions, the ones who couldn't fly across the country and demand a meeting, simply absorbed it and went home and were expected to keep absorbing it in silence. That's the part that should stay with you. Most people never get the apology. Most people never get the room or the sheet of paper or the second chance. So here's the real lesson, and it isn't about being cruel in a lobby. Real power was never the empire Vivian built, the corner office, the name on the building, the ability to have someone removed with a lift of her hand. And real leadership was never the fear she could command from the top of a room. The truest measure of anyone with power is what they do with the people who can do nothing for them in return. The stranger, the one in the plain shirt, the one everybody else has already decided doesn't count. You can run a company worth hundreds of millions and fail that test in 3 seconds, or you can have nothing to prove and pass it without thinking. And the difference between those two people is the whole of what matters. So, let me ask you something before you go. When was the last time you sized someone up and decided before they opened their mouth exactly who they were? Have you ever walked past someone's humanity to get to a transaction? And if you'd been standing in that lobby, would you have shaken his hand or would you have been Vivian? Be honest. That's where change actually starts. If this story moved, you do something with it. Look at your own assumptions before they cost someone else. Treat the person who can't promote you or fund you or help you with exactly the dignity you'd give the most important person in the room, because that is the only real test there is. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been judged before you got to speak? Share this with someone who needs the reminder and subscribe, because the way we treat the people we think don't matter is the truest measure of who we are, and the best leaders are simply the ones who understood that first. Respect isn't something you earn by dressing for it. It's something every person is owed the moment they walk through the door.